I never imagined that the day my own son would throw me out of the house would come like this, without warning, without talking, without even an apology. It was quick, dry, as if I were just a forgotten object in the corner of the room, something that disturbed the harmony of that home that, deep down, was never mine again. I was still holding a cup of coffee when he said I needed to go, and I remember thinking that the coffee would cool down before I even understood what was going on. His wife was behind, arms crossed, hard look, that same look that had accompanied me since the day I got sick and had to move to their house. There was never real acceptance, only disguised tolerance. I was the living memory of a past that she wanted to erase, and at that moment it was clear that the decision had already been made long before it was announced. There was no discussion. There was no room for explanations. My son avoided my eyes while repeating that it was better for everyone, that I would fit in, that it didn't mean abandonment. Empty words, thrown like crumbs to relieve one's own guilt. I just listened, in silence, feeling something break inside me with a frightening calm. When they asked me to pack my things, I didn't cry. I walked to the room they gave me, small, impersonal, temporary from day one, and pulled out the old suitcase that I never completely unpacked. Maybe I always knew that this shelter wouldn't last. Maybe my body knew before my mind. As I folded the few clothes, my hands trembled, not from weakness, but from restraint. Each piece put in the suitcase seemed to confirm a cruel truth. I was no longer needed. It was not welcome. It was not family. The sound of the zipper closing echoed too loudly in that quiet room. When I returned to the room, the scene seemed rehearsed. My son held the door. His wife had already moved away as if my presence was contagious. No hugs, no attempt to stop me. Just hurry. Hurry for me to cease to exist in that space. The most painful moment was not leaving, but realizing that no one asked where I was going. There was no concern about the night that was approaching, about my medicines, about my tiredness. It was as if, when I crossed that door, I automatically ceased to be someone's responsibility. Outside, the air was cold, the kind of cold that enters through the bones and settles in the chest. I held the handle of the suitcase tight while I felt the looks of the neighbors, curious and uncomfortable. The humiliation didn't scream, she whispered, slow and deep. I descended the steps carefully, not out of fragility, but because each step seemed to mark the end of a lifetime of silent sacrifices. I gave everything for that son, everything. And now she was there, reduced to a lady with a suitcase and no explanation. As I walked away from the house, I heard the door close behind me. The sound was definitive. It wasn't just a door, it was a chapter being forcibly closed. I stopped for a moment on the sidewalk, took a deep breath and continued walking, even without knowing exactly where. The weight of the suitcase increased with each step, not because of what was inside, but because of what it represented. Memories, decisions, secrets. Things I had carried for decades in silence, believing that love justified everything. At that moment, as I walked alone down the street, I still didn't know that this expulsion was not the end. It was the beginning, and that the same suitcase used to dispose of me would soon be the only thing capable of revealing the truth that everyone made a point of forgetting. The fact that you're here, hearing this story so far, says a lot about who you are. What follows isn't just a personal account. It's a truth that many people live in silence, and that changes the way we view family, loyalty, and dignity. If you believe that stories like this need to continue to be told, subscribe to the channel. Because they're not just about me, they're about all of us. I walked for a few blocks aimlessly, as if my feet knew something my head still refused to accept. Each window reflected a version of me that I hardly recognized. An aged, tired woman, carrying a suitcase too big for someone who, according to her own family, no longer needed almost anything. That image hurt more than any words spoken inside that house. I've always been like that for them, someone who takes up too much space and talks too little. Since I became a widow, my presence has been tolerated, never desired. I could see it in the small gestures, in the impatient sighs, in the interrupted conversations when I entered the room, in the glances exchanged as if I were a problem to be solved. When my health began to fail, they promised care. They said it would be temporary, that I would not be alone. The truth is that, from the first day on that borrowed sofa, I was already a nuisance. Not a mother, not a story, just an aging body remembering that time passes for everyone. My son changed with me little by little, not abruptly, but constantly. He stopped asking me how I was. He started talking to me as if I were a confused child, always in a hurry, always busy, always justifying the impatient tone as tiredness. I accepted, because mothers learn early to diminish themselves so as not to lose the little they have left. His wife never tried to hide her contempt. She was polite in front of others, but cold when we were alone. I made a point of reminding myself that this was not my home, that I was there for a favor. I smiled, thanked, and swallowed every word as if it were deserved. What hurt me most was not the hostility, but the invisibility. I spoke, and no one listened. I warned them, and no one took them seriously. My memories were treated as confusion, my worries as exaggeration. To be old, I realized, was to be disposable even before I died. As I walked, I thought about how many times I had been silent to avoid conflict, how many truths I swallowed to maintain a false peace, how many decisions I accepted without question, believing that a mother's love required this kind of sacrifice. The street seemed too long, and the weight of the suitcase was beginning to punish my arm. But the biggest weight was inside me. It wasn't just the expulsion. It was the realization that, for them, I had been nobody for a long time. The expulsion was just the formalization of that. I sat on a bench, took a deep breath, and watched the people walk by. Nobody noticed me. I was just another tired lady on an ordinary afternoon, and for the first time, this invisibility did not hurt so much. She brought something different, a fertile silence. There, sitting alone, I began to understand that the fragile image they created of me was also the perfect armor. No one fears what they do not see. No one protects themselves from what they consider harmless. The suitcase rested at my feet, closed, old, discreet. Inside it, much more than clothes. Inside it, pieces of a lifetime of difficult decisions, always made with others in mind. Decisions that now demanded me again. I still didn't know how or when, but something inside me began to reorganize itself. The invisible woman was tired of disappearing. And on that park bench, humiliated and alone, I felt, for the first time in many years, that perhaps it was still possible to exist in another way. When I finally found a temporary place to spend the night, my hands were numb from holding the suitcase. The room was simple, almost impersonal, but there was silence. And at that moment, silence was all I needed. I put the suitcase on the bed and spent a few seconds just looking at it, as if it were a stranger watching me from back. That suitcase had been with me for decades. It was not pretty, nor modern. She was resistant, marked by time, just like me. I always kept it closed, even when I moved into my son's house. There were things inside that didn't belong to the present, and I naively believed that the past only hurt when it was remembered. I sat down slowly and took a deep breath before unzipping it. The sound was slow, almost solemn. On top were old clothes, folded with excessive care, as if I wanted to preserve not the fabric, but the era in which they were used. I pushed them away and felt my heart race, as if I knew exactly what would come next. The papers were there, organized in yellowed envelopes. Letters, documents, records that I reread countless times over the years, always promising myself that they would never be needed. Each envelope carried a choice. Each leaf, a silent renunciation, made in the name of the family. As I touched the first document, my hands trembled, not of fear, but of recognition. That wasn't just a roll. It was proof that I carried alone a burden that should never have been mine alone, a secret that has shaped my entire adult life and, without me realizing it, has also shaped theirs. The letters were there too, written in a handwriting I knew well. Some were never sent, others, read only by me. Words that explained decisions, justified silences, and revealed betrayals that I chose to hide to protect those who today discarded me without hesitation. I felt a strange mixture of pain and clarity. Everything started to make sense in a cruel way. My daughter-in-law's attitudes, the rush to move away, the fear disguised as irritation. They didn't just see me as a nuisance. They were afraid of what I was carrying, even though they didn't know exactly what. I closed my eyes for a moment and allowed myself to feel the real weight of that suitcase. It wasn't physical. It was moral. Years of silence, of submission, of choices always made to avoid scandals, conflicts, ruptures. I had believed that protecting others would protect me too. But there, alone in that strange room, I realized the hardest truth of all. My silence did not build gratitude. He built neglect. He built the false security that I would never react, never speak, never take up space. I took one of the envelopes and held it to my chest. For the first time, I was not ashamed of what it contained. I felt responsibility. The responsibility of not allowing that history to continue to be written only by others. The woman who left home humiliated still existed inside me. But next to her, another one began to awaken. More lucid, more attentive, too tired to continue being invisible. The suitcase, which once represented escape, now looked like a warning. That night, as I put the documents back carefully, I understood something fundamental. The weight of that suitcase was always the weight of the truth. And the truth, when ignored for too long, finds a way to demand space, even if it is by force. I always knew that secret wouldn't grow old with me. No matter how many times I repeated that I was doing the right thing, that it was for his good, that certain truths only destroy. Deep down, I knew that buried truths don't die. They rot, and the smell eventually escapes through some crack. I opened the suitcase again that morning, unable to sleep. The dim light of the lamp made everything even more intimate, almost confessional. I took the oldest envelope, the one I avoided even touching. The paper was thin, fragile, as if it reflected exactly the state of the decision he represented. Decades ago, when I made the choice to be silent, I still believed that love was enough to sustain any lie. I believed that protecting my son from a cruel truth would make him happier, more whole, safer. I did not consider that I was, at the same time, handing him a life built on false ground. The secret did not only involve marital betrayal, it involved identity, heritage, belonging. It involved hastily made legal decisions, documents signed with trembling hands, and promises made under oaths that should never have been required. I accepted everything in silence, convinced that my sacrifice would end the problem there. But the years passed, and what should have remained in the past began to shape the present. Small distortions, inexplicable discomforts, cold attitudes that I couldn't name. I thought it was just time, adulthood, the natural distance between mothers and children. Today, I realized that it was the lie charging interest. I remember the night I put those papers in my suitcase. I cried silently, sitting on the floor of the room, afraid of myself. Fear of not being able to sustain that decision forever. Fear of one day being forced to choose between truth and love. I chose love, or at least that's what I thought at the time. Now, looking back, I see that I chose fear. Fear of losing my son, fear of judgment, fear of the chaos that truth would cause, fear of being seen as responsible for a breakup that I didn't create alone. The cruelest thing is to realize that, even after everything, I still tried to protect him. Even though I was pushed out of his house, even though I was treated like a nuisance, I hesitated to open that suitcase. Part of me still wanted to believe that I could leave quietly once again, but silence has a limit, and it breaks when dignity begins to bleed. When I was expelled, something broke definitively inside me. It wasn't love, it was submission. It wasn't the care, it was the guilt I carried for something that was never mine alone. There, in that strange bed, I accepted what I had been avoiding for years. My secret was no longer mine alone. He had become a gun pointed at me, and to remain silent meant to allow it to be used until it completely destroyed me. I ran my fingers through the documents as if saying goodbye to an old version of herself. The woman who believed that enduring everything was synonymous with strength was falling behind. In her place, someone emerged who finally understood that survival also requires confrontation. That night, I made a silent pact with myself. If that truth needed to come out, it would come on my terms, not out of impulsive revenge, not out of desperation, but out of justice. The suitcase is no longer a hiding place. It became a decision. The next morning, I woke up with a heavy body and a mind too alert for someone who had barely slept. The temporary room didn't belong to me, and that feeling of having nowhere to go back hit me hard. For the first time, I realized that my situation wasn't just emotionally unfair, it was dangerous. My meds were almost gone. The health insurance documents had been left at my son's house. The money I had in my purse would not cover many days. Until then, I had always believed that, despite everything, my age would protect me from sudden falls. I discovered there that old age does not protect, she explains. As I reviewed the papers in the suitcase more closely, something became clear and icy inside me. Part of what was in my son's name, assets, accounts, legal decisions, was only like this because I allowed it, because I trusted, because I accepted incomplete versions of the truth in the name of family peace. If I remained silent, I would lose more than a roof over my head. I would lose rights, autonomy, voice. The expulsion had not been just a gesture of rejection, it was a move. Simple, efficient, and cruel. By moving away, they gained time to consolidate everything. For the first time, I felt real fear. Not the abstract fear of loneliness, but the concrete fear of those who can lose everything. My financial security, my health, my dignity. I realized that it was not an exaggeration to think that this situation could take me to the bottom, too fast for anyone to notice. The most painful thing was to understand that my son knew this. He knew my limitations, my dependencies, my risks. And yet, she chose the comfort of marriage over the care of her own mother. This realization was harsher than any scream or offense. I spent hours thinking about whether I should call him, ask for help, ask for explanations, to ask for mercy. The idea made my stomach churn. I had asked for too much all my life. That situation no longer required supplication. It required action. The secret I had protected for decades now threatened me. It was no longer guarded out of love, but used as a shadow over my head. It was as if each old decision was taking its toll at once. I sat down at the small table in the room and began to list everything I could lose if I remained motionless. Every line written was a reality check. Each word reinforced that there was no room for hesitation. The woman who had accepted crumbs for years was still trembling inside me. But for the first time, she wasn't alone. Something firmer began to rise. Not with uncontrolled anger, but with clarity. I understood then that it was no longer about reconciliation. It was about survival. And surviving sometimes requires facing the one you've spent your whole life protecting. At that moment, I closed the suitcase with renewed care. Not as one who hides, but as one who prepares. I still didn't know exactly how, but I knew one thing for sure. If I didn't move now, I would be erased for good. I spent a good part of the morning staring at the phone, as if it could give me answers before I even dialed. Asking for help had always been difficult for me, but at that stage of life it had become almost humiliating. Still, I knew I had to try. Not out of pride, but because isolation is also a slow way to die. I first called a distant relative. I explained the situation carefully, choosing words that didn't sound like accusation. On the other side, I heard silence, followed by sentences that were too polite, too empty. Maybe it was a misunderstanding, they said. You know how complicated marriages are. It was easier to doubt myself than to face reality. The second call was worse. The person listened to the end and, with an embarrassed laugh, suggested that I was exaggerating because of my age. That word, age, fell like a stamp on everything I said. It didn't matter the content. I was already classified as emotionally unstable before I even finished the sentence. I hung up the phone with a shaky hand, feeling a mixture of anger and shame, not because I had called, but because I realized how much my image had already been eroded. I was no longer seen as someone trustworthy. I was the troubled mother, the sensitive old woman, the confused woman. I tried it a third time, this time with someone who had known my story for years, someone who saw me work, raise a child alone, survive losses. Even so, the answer came loaded with caution. Are you sure what you're saying? That question hit me harder than any direct denial. There, something inside me began to harden. It wasn't a grudge, it was lucidity. I realized that asking for help the way I had always asked for it, cautiously, guiltily, afraid to bother, would no longer work. The world does not listen to those who apologize for existing. What hurt the most was not the lack of support, but the ease with which they accepted the implicit version of my daughter-in-law and my son, without evidence, without listening to the other side, without even imagining that maybe I was right. I was the weakest link, and weak links are disposable. I sat back on the bed and took a deep breath. For the first time, I seriously thought about the possibility that I would have to go through all of this almost alone. The idea scared me, but it also freed me from an old expectation, that of being saved by someone. As I reorganized the documents in the suitcase, I realized that I was trying the wrong way. I was looking for emotional support when, in fact, I needed structure. I didn't need to be believed in me out of pity. He needed them to recognize facts. It was at that moment that something changed definitively. Humiliation began to lose space to strategy. If I was treated as confused, then I would speak through papers. If my word had no weight, I would let the record speak for me. The woman who accepted vague explanations and polite apologies began to withdraw. In her place, someone more restrained, more objective, less willing to beg for validation emerged. It wasn't coldness, it was self-preservation. That afternoon, I put my phone in my purse and made a silent decision. I would no longer ask for help from anyone who was not willing to listen. The next person I looked for would not be family. He would be someone who understood truths and consequences. It took me almost a whole day to accept that I needed to look for someone outside the family. The mere thought made my stomach knot, as if I were breaking an invisible rule that I had followed all my life, to solve everything by myself, in silence, without exposing anyone. But at that point, silence no longer protected me. He put me at risk. I sat for hours with the phone in my hand, reliving faces, names, old conversations, people who were once part of my life, but who were lost over time, with widowhood, with old age, until a name came up with unexpected clarity. Someone who knew me before I was reduced to the role of an inconvenient mother. Someone who has always valued facts more than emotional versions. When I called, my voice came out too controlled, almost strange. He only said that he needed to talk in person. I didn't ask for help. I didn't explain anything. And maybe that's what worked. He just replied that he would be available and told me the address. No questions, no excessive curiosity. That neutrality was already a relief. I arrived at the place with my heart racing, hoping once again to find doubt in the eyes of those who received me. But that is not what happened. He greeted me respectfully, pulled up a chair, and waited. There was no hurry, there was no condescension. For the first time in a long time, I felt that I didn't need to prove that I was lucid. I started telling my story from the beginning, and as I spoke, I realized how much I myself had minimized everything for years. The expulsion, the ultimatum, the abandonment disguised as necessity. I talked about the suitcase, what it carried, the reason I had never opened it in front of anyone. My voice cracked at times, but I kept going. When I finished, the silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was heavy. He asked to see the documents. I opened the suitcase carefully, almost solemnly. Each envelope removed seemed to also remove a layer of the submissive woman I had been for so long. As he reviewed the papers, I watched his expressions change. There was no exaggerated astonishment, but there was concentration. He read, reread, compared dates, made small notes. It gave me something I hadn't felt in decades. Real validation. Not emotional, but concrete. It was then that he looked up and said with frightening calm that this was serious. That I was not only dealing with family conflicts, but with legal decisions made under omission and manipulation. That my recent departure did not seem like a coincidence. That sentence fell on me like a cold blade. It all made sense at once. The rush to get me out of the house, the calculated coldness of my daughter-in-law, my son's discomfort. It wasn't just rejection, it was fear. Fear of what I represented, even without saying a word. I felt a wave of panic rise in my chest. The idea of facing something of that magnitude, involving my own son, almost made me retreat. I thought about how many times I chose to swallow truths to preserve ties. I thought about how much I had always feared being seen as the cause of conflict. But this time, fear did not win. He went straight with me. He said it would not be easy, that I could be attacked, discredited, exposed. He said that many times when the truth threatens privileges, the reaction is violent. But he also said something that echoed deeply. I had rights, and he had proof. The word rights resonated within me as something foreign. I spent my life associating dignity with sacrifice. To hear that I could claim something without apologizing was almost revolutionary. It was not revenge, it was correction. When I left that meeting, the world seemed slightly different. Not safer, but sharper. I was no longer walking in the dark. He knew where he stepped, even if the ground was unstable. I walked slowly, feeling the weight of the suitcase in a new way. It was no longer a shameful burden. It was an anchor, something that kept me steady as everything around me tried to push me out. That night, as I put the documents back away, I realized that something essential had changed. I still felt pain. I was still afraid. But I no longer felt submission. The woman who accepted everything so as not to lose anyone was falling behind. I didn't know exactly how that path would end, but for the first time in many years, I knew I wouldn't end up on my knees. And that certainty, silent and steadfast, was the beginning of the woman I was about to become. I woke up that morning different. Not better, not lighter, different. Fear was still there, lodged deep in my chest, but it no longer commanded my movements. It had been displaced by something firmer, quieter, a kind of cold lucidity that I had never allowed to exist in me. I prepared a simple coffee and sat at the table as if I were starting a ritual. For the first time, I didn't think about what I had lost, but about what was still at stake. My mind began to organize facts, dates, decisions. It was as if, for years, everything had been shuffled on purpose, and now the pieces finally accepted to be fitted. I opened the suitcase again, but this time not with emotion. I opened it with method. I separated documents in chronological order, reread letters with another look, marked inconsistencies that I had previously ignored for emotional convenience. It was no longer the mother trying to protect her child. She was a woman analyzing her own history with brutal honesty. Each role seemed to confirm something I resisted accepting. I wasn't just passive, I was convenient for everyone. My silence facilitated decisions, avoided explanations, protected images, and while I believed I was being noble, I was being used as the basis for an entire structure of lies. This realization hurt more than the expulsion, because the expulsion was their act, but silence was my choice. And recognizing this took courage. Not to blame myself, but to stop repeating the pattern. I spent the whole morning writing. Not emotional letters, no outbursts. I wrote objective, almost cold lines. I listed facts. I connected events. The more I wrote, the more I realized something strange. I was in control. Not of the consequences, but of the narrative. The old version of me always spoke trying to please, trying to soften, trying to be understood. That version was no longer useful. Now, I needed to be clear, not nice. Precise, not docile. That wasn't hardening. It was late maturity. At one point, I found myself in front of the bedroom mirror. I stopped. I watched my face with real attention for the first time in years. I saw wrinkles, tiredness, marks of those who lived more for others than for themselves. But I also saw something new in the eyes: presence. I noticed that my body posture had changed, shoulders less hunched, deeper breathing. It was not a pose. It was internal alignment. My body began to follow the decision my mind had already made. Fear returned in waves, of course. I thought about the confrontation, in the judgment of others, in my son's eyes when he realized that I would not back down. But this time the fear was accompanied by a different question. What happens if I don't do anything? And the answer was always the same. I would disappear. The woman who accepted being diminished to maintain ties began to seem distant, almost strange. I understood her choices, but I no longer recognized myself in her. That woman survived as best she could. Now it was my turn to live differently. I closed the suitcase in the late afternoon, but I didn't put it away. It stayed there, visible, present, as a constant reminder of what I was willing to face. There was no escape possible, and surprisingly, it brought me peace. That day, without dramatic announcements or grandiose promises, I crossed an invisible point. I stopped being just the victim of an unfair story and became the conscious author of the next chapter. And for the first time since I was kicked out, I slept knowing that no matter what came, I would no longer be pushed out of my own life. I realized that something had changed even before any direct confrontation. It was not a call, nor a clear message. It was a feeling, a subtle displacement in the air, as when someone realizes that they have lost control of a situation that they believed they had mastered. Their enforced tranquility began to crumble in silence. The first sign came indirectly. A mutual acquaintance called me, his voice too careful, asking if I was okay. That question was never innocent. It always came loaded with something unsaid. I felt like conversations were happening far away from me, versions being planted before I opened my mouth. Shortly after, my son's first message arrived. Cold, short, without affection. He said he was worried about my emotional state and suggested that I rest, that I avoid hasty decisions. I read those words several times, not out of apparent concern, but because of the exact choice of tone. He no longer spoke to me as a mother. He spoke as someone trying to control me. The daughter-in-law did not speak directly, but I felt her in every sentence he wrote. It was the same vocabulary, the same strategic care in appearing reasonable. That confirmed something I had been avoiding admitting. She always drove more than she appeared, and he allowed it. I answered objectively, without emotion. He said he was fine, that he was taking care of personal matters, and that he would speak at the appropriate time. I didn't give details. I didn't explain myself. It was the first time I didn't offer comfort to those who tried to silence me. The answer came too quickly. My son insisted, now with a slight tone of irritation. He asked who I was talking to. It suggested that I was being influenced. That word, influenced, ignited something in me. It was not a concern. It was fear. I realized then that they knew. Maybe not everything, but enough to make them feel threatened. My previous silence had made them comfortable. My current posture made them insecure. And insecurity always reveals the real character of people. In the following days, the attempts to discredit me became more evident. Subtle comments about my health, insinuations of mental confusion, distorted accounts of the expulsion, all carefully spread out to create an image, that of the unstable mother who needed to be protected from herself. Years ago, this would have worked. I would have backed off, afraid of being seen as problematic. But now I saw the game clearly. It wasn't personal, it was strategic, and that made everything simpler to face. The most painful thing was to realize how much my son had learned to use this type of speech. It didn't come naturally to him. Someone taught him. Someone showed that, in front of an older woman, it was enough to question sanity to nullify any argument. Instead of reacting, I watched. I wrote it down. I kept messages. I recorded times, words, changes in tone. Each attempt to diminish me became, without them noticing, one more proof of what I had been facing. The old version of me would have begged for dialogue. He would have tried to clear up misunderstandings. That version is behind us. Now I understood that those who distort reality do not seek conversation. They seek control. As I closed out the day, I felt something paradoxical. Deep sadness, yes, but also a strange calm. The masks were falling. Not before the world yet, but before me. And this was already irreversible. I didn't know how long it would take until the final confrontation, but he was sure of one thing. They were no longer calm. And those who lose their tranquility usually make mistakes. I just needed to be ready for when that happened. The attempt to silence me ceased to be subtle one gray morning when I received a notification that made my stomach sink. It was not an affectionate message or a request for conversation. It was a warning disguised as a formality, cold as letterhead. There, for the first time, it became clear that they weren't just nervous. They were taking action. My son wrote to me saying that he was taking action to avoid future confusion. He spoke of protection, of responsibility, of difficult decisions that someone needed to make for me. Reading those words caused me a physical shock. It was the language of absolute control, carefully packaged as care. The threat was not explicit, but it was evident. There was talk of evaluations, documents, third parties more qualified to deal with me. It was the oldest and cruelest attempt of all, to take away my autonomy under the pretext of zeal. That was not a concern. It was a declaration of silent war. I felt a tremor rise through my legs, not of fragility, but of indignation. I had spent my whole life supporting other people's decisions, and now they tried to officially erase me. It wasn't enough to kick me out of the house. They wanted to remove me from the narrative itself. I took a deep breath and read the message again, this time with another look. Each sentence was calculated, every word chosen to appear reasonable in front of strangers. They were anticipating, preparing the ground for any reaction from me to be seen as confirmation of their version. It was at that moment that I understood the real dimension of the risk. It was not just about goods or money. It was about the right to decide about one's own life. And losing that would mean losing everything. I contacted my ally immediately. I showed the message. I didn't have to explain much. He confirmed what I already felt in my body. It was a clear attempt to intimidate me. And, paradoxically, it was also their mistake. Mistake because they acted too soon. Mistake because they left traces. Error because they underestimated my ability to register, save, and wait. The hurry, always her, began to work against those who believed they were in control. I spent the rest of the day organizing everything even more rigorously. Messages, dates, times, changes in tone. Each attempt to reduce myself became one more line in the real story I was building. Not angrily, but accurately. Fear has returned, of course. Fear of facing my own son in such a harsh field. Fear of public judgment. Fear of being seen as ungrateful, cruel, exaggerated. But this time, the fear was accompanied by something new: decision. I could no longer retreat without losing myself completely. The threat had crossed an invisible line. It was no longer possible to pretend that everything could be resolved with a difficult conversation or a late apology. That night, as I closed my suitcase, I felt the weight of the real responsibility of what I was about to do. There was no more room for hesitation. Confrontation was not an emotional choice. It was a necessity. I looked at my reflection in the mirror and saw a woman who was tired. Yes, but firm. A woman who had been pushed too far to keep trying to please. The weakness they believed they could use against me had turned into something much more dangerous. I knew that from then on, my every step would be observed. Every word, interpreted. But he also knew that those who threaten first tend to fear more than they show. And on that silent night, I made the only promise that still mattered. I wouldn't allow anyone to erase me, nor as a mother, nor as a woman, nor as the owner of her own history. After the veiled threat, I understood that there was no more room for improvisation. Every gesture of mine needed to be thought of, every word measured. The time when I acted only by emotion was behind me. Now everything required precision. I wasn't preparing for a difficult conversation. I was preparing for a clash. I spent days reviewing documents, rereading messages, organizing everything in an order that made sense to those who never wanted to listen to me. Each test needed to speak for itself. I wouldn't count on empathy. It would rely on facts. That gave me a strange sense of quiet power. My ally was clear. It was not enough to be right. It was necessary to appear incontestable. This required calm, control, and, above all, emotional resistance. I would have to listen to lies told with conviction, distorted versions of my own life, attempts to provoke me so that I would lose my balance. I prepared for this as someone preparing for a long crossing. I practiced my answers in silence. Not to convince, but not to explain myself too much. I learned that those who talk too much weaken themselves. I needed to say only what was necessary, at the right time, in the right way. Nothing more than that. There were nights when pain tried to pull me back. Memories of my young son, of the house we built together, of the choices made out of love. At those times, I had to be myself. Love cannot be used as an instrument of annulment. If I gave in there, I would lose everything I had built internally. The hardest thing was to accept that the confrontation would not bring immediate relief. There would be no catharsis. There would be no sincere apology. The most I could hope for was justice. And even that would come at a high emotional cost. Accepting this reality was part of my empowerment. I separated the suitcase into compartments. It was no longer a single, confusing object. Each envelope had a function. Each paper had a clear purpose. That brought me an almost professional feeling. I was no longer dealing with the past. I was conducting a process. I also started to take care of myself with more discipline, sleep better, eat regularly, walk, not just for vanity or health, but for strategy. I needed to be whole. Any sign of fragility would be used against me. On one of those days, I found myself smiling alone in front of the mirror, not for happiness, but for recognition. I hardly recognized this organized, centered, silently firm woman. It has always been there. It has just never been needed before. The old version of me would have warned, asked for a conversation, tried to soften the impact. That version has not returned. The confrontation would not be announced. He would come when it was inevitable, when all the pieces were in place. I knew that when the truth emerged, it wouldn't just hit my son and daughter-in-law. It would achieve the image they have built of themselves. And this usually causes unpredictable reactions. I needed to be prepared for that too. In the solitude of my room, I closed my suitcase one last time before what was to come. Not afraid. With respect for what she carried. That was not revenge. It was a late correction. I didn't know exactly how the confrontation would happen, nor how long it would take. But I knew I was ready. Ready not to back down. Ready to sustain silence when they tried to provoke me. Ready to exist whole, even in the face of attack. And at that moment, I had a serene certainty. Regardless of the result, I had already won something fundamental. I was no longer a woman waiting for permission to speak. I was someone who knew exactly when and why to speak. What comes now is the hardest part to tell, because to reveal it, I need to give up the last protection I had: silence. Sharing that means accepting losses, judgments, and consequences that still hurt, even today. If you've come this far with me, it's because you understand that some truths only hurt as long as they are hidden. So I urge you to sign up, not as a support for me, but as a way to ensure that stories like this continue to have a voice. The day of the confrontation arrived without warning, but my body knew. I woke up before the alarm clock, with an uncomfortable lucidity, as if each cell was on alert. It was not common nervousness. It was the exact awareness that I was about to cross a point of no return. Anything that happened afterwards would be a consequence, not a choice. The environment where everything would happen was cold, bureaucratic, made to neutralize emotions. Still, I felt the weight of the place as soon as I entered. People sitting, eyes trained to observe reactions, heavy silence. I walked slowly, not out of hesitation, but out of control. The suitcase was with me, not as a symbol of humiliation, but as an extension of my decision. When I saw my son, I felt a short, dry pain that didn't spread. He avoided my gaze with an almost childlike concentration. The daughter-in-law, next to her, maintained a rigid posture, that rehearsed expression of someone who believes that everything can still be circumvented with well-chosen words. For the first time, I was not afraid of them. I felt distance. The opening lines came loaded with technical terms, well-trained justifications, that polished narrative that transforms cruelty into zeal. They spoke of worry, instability, decisions made in the heat of the moment. Meanwhile, I watched. Each sentence said, without me interrupting, dug their hole a little deeper. There was a moment when I almost felt sorry. Not because of fragility, but because of illusion. They truly believed that they still had control, that I would back off, that I would cry, that I would beg not to lose the little that was left of the family. They didn't realize that this woman no longer existed. When it was my turn, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't make a speech. I didn't mention feelings. I simply opened the suitcase. The sound of the zipper seemed too loud in that quiet space. Some people looked up. Others leaned forward. The attention, finally, was mine. I placed the documents on the table carefully, as if arranging pieces of a puzzle that had always been complete, just hidden. I explained each one precisely. Dates, decisions, omissions. There was no accusation in my tone. There was clarity. And clarity, I found, is deeply uncomfortable for those who live by distortions. As I spoke, I noticed the subtle change in their behavior. The daughter-in-law began to move too much. My son took frequent deep breaths. Small reactions from those who realized that the rehearsed story no longer supports its own weight. They were no longer in charge of the narrative. When they tried to interrupt me, I stopped. I waited. I looked. And I continued. For the first time in my entire life, I didn't give way to being run over. That wasn't anger. It was presence. And presence does not ask for permission. There was a specific moment, small, almost imperceptible, when everything turned around. A poorly explained detail, a date that didn't close, a response too quick to seem spontaneous. The silence that followed was devastating. Not for me, but for them. My son tried to speak. His voice came out trembling, insecure, contradictory. He looked to his wife for support, but she could no longer maintain the same firmness. It was there that the truth became public, not as a scandal, but as evidence. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel like exposing more than necessary. It wasn't about emotional punishment, it was about correction. And this awareness kept me firm when I realized that formal referrals would be necessary. What was at stake went beyond any attempt at superficial conciliation. When it was all over, I collected the documents as calmly as I had placed them on the table. I closed the suitcase slowly. My hands didn't tremble. My body didn't back down. I had crossed the center of the fire without setting myself on fire. As I left that place, the world looked the same. Cars, people, ordinary noises. But I wasn't. Something essential had reorganized itself within me. The woman who was expelled from home still existed in her memory, yes, but the woman who came out of that confrontation was another, whole, lucid, and impossible to be erased. And as I walked away, I was silently sure that this was not just an audience, a meeting, or a clash. It was the exact moment when I stopped being seen as a problem, and I began to be recognized as truth. After the confrontation, nothing happened immediately, and that was the most telling. There were no desperate calls, no apologies. The silence that settled was heavy, loaded with something I recognized well: loss of control. They no longer knew how to act with me. The following days brought discreet but profound consequences. People who previously avoided me started to look at me differently, not with pity, but with caution. The story had escaped domestic control and now circulated in spaces where fragile versions do not hold up for long. My son tried to contact me a few times. Long messages, full of justifications, written as if trying to rebuild an image that collapsed too quickly. I read everything carefully, but I didn't answer. Not out of revenge, but because there was no longer any urgency. Those who run behind no longer dictate the pace. The daughter-in-law, on the other hand, disappeared. No message. No attempt at explanation. Her silence was different. It wasn't guilt. It was calculation. She hoped that time would erase the impact, as she always did. For the first time, I knew I wouldn't erase. The most painful thing was to realize that their fall was not accompanied by real repentance. It was accompanied by resentment, as if I had broken an invisible rule, to accept anything quietly. They did not see themselves as responsible. They saw themselves as victims of my overreaction. This realization hurt me, but it did not bring me down, because, for the first time, I didn't need to be recognized for my worth in order to validate it. I had already crossed the worst possible point, being discredited, and survived. The practical consequences began to emerge. Ongoing processes, revisions, questions. Nothing fast, nothing simple. Justice rarely is. But the mere fact that they could no longer pretend normality was already an irreversible rupture. There was a specific moment when I realized that everything had changed. I was sitting in a public setting when I heard my name mentioned with respect. Not as the difficult mother, not as the confused lady, but as someone who had the courage to face something too big to ignore. I felt a strange mixture of relief and grief. Relief for no longer being alone in her own story. I fight for the family I imagined I had, but that never really existed. That image was broken definitively. I thought a lot about my son these days, not with constant anger, but with sad clarity. He wasn't just a man who made mistakes. It was someone who chose to benefit from my silence. Accepting this was part of my late maturation. Their fall was not spectacular. There was no public scandal, no explicit humiliation. It was slow, silent, and steady. The trust around him began to crumble, and confidence, once shaken, rarely recovers. I moved on without celebrating. There was no emotional victory there. There was correction, and correction sometimes comes with loneliness, but it was a different loneliness. Not that of abandonment, but that of independence. At that stage, I understood something essential. They didn't fall because I attacked them. They fell because they could not stand the light. I just opened the curtain, and when I realized this, I felt something I had never felt before in relation to my own trajectory: serene pride. Not because I have beaten anyone, but because I have not lost myself anymore. After the dust began to settle, came something that no one mentions when they talk about justice: emptiness. Not a dramatic emptiness, but a wide, almost uncomfortable silence, where there was no longer constant tension or expectations of others to manage. For the first time in a long time, there was no one pushing or pulling me. I was alone with myself. In the first few days, I felt a deep strangeness when I woke up without urgency. There were no threatening messages, no strategic preparations, no need to prove anything. That calm, which I had so much desired before, now required adaptation. Living without the weight of constant defense was almost a new learning. The pain did not disappear with the truth. She just changed shape. It no longer hurt as injustice, but as mourning. I fight for the son I thought I had raised, for the family I imagined existed, for the woman I was when I believed that enduring everything was a virtue. This grief came in silent waves, without warning. There were days when I even missed the conflict, because the conflict, as destructive as it was, still put me in relationship with them. Now, there was real distance. Not only physical, but emotional. A distance that cannot be crossed with requests or late explanations. My son tried to get closer one last time, not to ask for real forgiveness, but to ease one's conscience. His words came loaded with justifications, not responsibility. I listened carefully, but something inside me no longer moved easily. There was not enough anger to argue, nor enough hope to give in. I understood at that moment that reconciliation is not always a possible ending. Sometimes the most we can achieve is an emotional ceasefire, a distant, educated, fragile coexistence. And accepting this is also a form of maturity. I started to occupy my time in another way. Small daily rituals, choices made without consulting anyone, simple decisions that once seemed too big for me. To buy something because I wanted to leave when I needed to be silent without guilt. My body also started to respond differently. Less strain on the shoulders, deeper breathing, longer nights of sleep. Peace was not constant joy, but it was stability. And stability, after so much chaos, is a silent privilege. Some people naturally drifted away. Others approached with new respect. I made no effort to keep or remove anyone. For the first time, I let relationships find their own place without molding myself to fit into them. The most surprising thing was realizing that I didn't want to go back to who I was before. That woman endured too much, explained too much, forgave too soon. She was necessary to bring me here, but she didn't have to continue with me. Sometimes sadness still came, especially at night, not out of regret, but out of conscience. I knew exactly what I had lost, and also what I had gained. This clarity hurt, but it also strengthened. Over time, I understood that reconstruction is not about going back to the starting point. It is to create something new on what is left, not perfect, not idealized, but honest. And honesty, I learned late, is a rare kind of freedom. When I looked in the mirror one morning, I saw a different woman, no longer tough by defense, nor fragile by habit, just firm, present, entirely within one's own choices. I didn't come out of this story unscathed, but I left awake. And that, for someone who has spent his whole life erasing himself, was a profound form of rebirth. The reconstruction did not begin with major decisions, nor with visible changes to those who looked from the outside. It started almost imperceptibly, in the details that I had previously ignored. One day after another, waking up in the same place, but no longer being the same person who lay there the night before. It took me a while to accept that there would be no perfect closure. No final conversation that organized everything. No emotional scene in which everyone acknowledged their mistakes. Life rarely offers this kind of symmetry. What it offers sometimes is just the chance to move on without lying to yourself. I found a small place to call my own. Nothing sophisticated, nothing that would impress anyone, but it was mine. Each object was there because I chose it. Every silence was respected. For the first time, my home didn't have to tolerate me. It welcomed me. I started to organize my days without haste. I learned to listen to my own tiredness, my own will. Simple things have gained another weight. Preparing a meal, walking aimlessly, sitting by the window and just watching the world go on without demanding anything from me. My son remained at a distance. There were some timid attempts at contact, always careful, always incomplete. There has been no full reconciliation, and perhaps there never will be. The bond exists, but it is fragile, cautious, crossed by something that can no longer be ignored. And I accepted that. Accepting did not mean agreeing, nor forgetting. It meant stopping fighting against a reality that would not mold itself to what I wanted. Some relationships don't recover. They transform. Others only survive at a distance. That was one of the hardest lessons. I no longer feel the need to explain my version to those who don't want to listen. The truth fulfilled its role. Now she rests. Not as something forgotten, but as something integrated. I no longer carry it as a weapon or as an open wound. Sometimes I still feel sadness. Not the one that paralyzes, but the one that accompanies those who have experienced something too big to pass unscathed. This sadness does not weaken me. She reminds me of everything I've been through without disappearing. People started to see me differently. Not because I changed my appearance, but because my presence changed. There is something different about those who have already been underestimated and survived without apologizing. Something that is not taught, conquered. I didn't become bitter. I also did not become indulgent. I became selective. With my words, with my affections, with the space I give to others within my life. This is not coldness. It is late maturity. The woman who was expelled from home still lives in me, as a memory and alert, but it doesn't define me anymore. It was the breaking point, not the final destination. The suitcase that once symbolized humiliation now rests empty, stored, weightless. There was no happy ending in the traditional sense. There was something better, an honest ending. With real losses, reconfigured bonds, and a woman who did not return to who she was, because she no longer needed to be. Today, when I look in the mirror, I don't see fragility. I see someone who was tested to the limit and didn't break. I see someone who learned late, but really learned. And that, in the end, is all I needed. If this story touched something in you, share this video. Not because it is my story, but because it reveals patterns that still silence many people within their own families. By sharing, you help this message reach those who need to remember that dignity has no age and that no imposed silence is normal. I'll stay here reading every comment. Tell me, from which city and country are you watching? And what about this story stayed with you? Your words really matter to me.